let's get the ball rolling. Jane, could you give us a little bit about your history and what you do?
Sure. So I started my career on the traditional publishing side. I worked for a mid-sized publisher in Cincinnati, and I spent 10 to 15 years in that traditional publishing sector. I took a little detour to university teaching, taught writing to students for a while at the University of Cincinnati. In 2014, I went full-time freelance, primarily serving an audience of writers, authors, and other people inside the publishing industry. So I focus on the business of publishing, how authors can succeed in their publishing goals, how to earn a living as a writer, if that is one of your goals. And I do that through online classes, newsletters, my website, speaking, engagements like this one. So yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you, Evan.
Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking all about building an author platform. Like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about building websites and social media and newsletters. Those are the sort of things that I think of as the key pillars to building an author platform. But I'd really love to get your perspective on what you see as the key pillars of building your own author platform. And maybe
Well,
also what you think of as an author platform to
yeah,
begin
it's
with.
it's a tortured term, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Um, so platform in its simplest definition is just your visibility to the readers that you're hoping to attract to your work. So there are lots of ways you can achieve that visibility. Um, Usually I like to talk about online forms of visibility versus offline, but that sometimes creates an artificial separation because one often strengthens the other. I would not really suggest focusing on one over the other because you're hobbling yourself. But I understand and accept that there are many authors who, at a particular moment in their careers or for other reasons, may have to prioritize one or just focus on one, and that's fine. So when I talk about platform from like what are the pillars or what are the different elements or what's the foundation of it, I try to talk in tangibles so that people can get a sense. So we're not talking about something that's really wibbly wobbly, very like amorphous. Um, but also, this is I want to underline that part of this is artificial. I'm creating this artificial construct to help you better understand what platform is, even though I think it's very squishy. So when I talk about the different pieces of it, I talk about things like author websites or blogs or newsletters or Substacks, your social media presence. I talk about your relationships, organizations you belong to, networks and communities that you are a part of, places where you are known, the VIPs or influencers that you might interact with or who know you or who might do you favors. So all of these things kind of, you put them into a big bucket and they all magically add up to this thing that we call platform. So there's a really nice distinction that one writer makes, Allison K. Williams, between general platform and what she calls lived platform. And I like this distinction because many people, they get anxious about platform. They think they don't have a platform, that it's something they somehow have to obtain. And I like the idea of lived platform because it indicates it's very organic. Your platform comes out of your life experience. It's not something that's separate from you that you are building out off on a hill. It comes out of your work, out of your relationships. And that's where I want to talk about the most important thing for building platform by far that everyone overlooks. Publish your work. Platform grows out of your work. Publishing books, publishing essays, publishing newsletters, Substacks, blogs, posting on social media, all of that constitutes your body of work. That is how people come to know you. That's how readers find you. It's through your work. So this is why I find it very backward when people haven't, say, published a word under their name, but they're convinced they have to build this platform before they can publish anything. Um, you will be very frustrated if you go down that path. I really feel like you've got to get some of your work out there, your voice, however you think of your work. We need some of that out for people to experience before you're going to start to build visibility. So I'll pause there because that's probably already a lot.
Starting early is better, but when you don't have anything, still a little bit difficult. When it comes to building a platform, is it different for fiction versus nonfiction authors?
I do find that it's quite different. And this is where a lot of confusion comes into play because you'll hear experts or professionals talk about platform, and what they really have in their head is platform for one particular type of genre, which may bear no relationship to what the area that you're working in. So where this the biggest way this comes into relevance here is your distinction fiction and nonfiction. So novelists in particular, I feel like one of the first ways and best ways you build platform is by simply publishing your work and getting it out onto the market. Even if, like in your example, even if you don't have a website, it is possible to build a platform without one. I don't think it's desirable, because I think you're missing a link in the chain that helps you have a more robust platform over time. But what's more important is that you're getting your work out there. And I do have a blog post I've written for those of you who are traditionally publishing, where I talk about that you don't need a platform to publish your novel or your children's book. If you're like pitching agents or traditional publishers, there are like some really, really, really what I consider insignificant exceptions to that, which probably don't apply to hardly anyone here. And they're mentioned in the article. So I really want to take that burden off novelists in particular. Please don't get all consumed by the platform question before you've even taken some of these first steps of like writing your books. But nonfiction is different, especially on the traditional publishing side, because people tend to buy your books because they have heard of you. This is why celebrities get book deals. It's why online influencers get book deals. It's why, people who have proximity to power get book deals, because we're very curious about their authority or experience. And we're just drawn to them because of that. And it just so happens they've expressed that in a book. They could have expressed it in some other way through a course or a newsletter or speaking or teaching, but the book is, part of what they're doing to tell their story. So, this is where we get into the advice from agents and publishers to build your platform before you pitch. It's really only applies to nonfiction authors. And then once we get on the self-publishing side of things, I mean, it's really all bets are off. It depends on what you're trying to do. And I find that in the self-publishing community in particular, most people are focusing on publishing their next book, and doing things that are not social media related, rather than tying themselves into knots over this question.
What I wanted to talk about next as well was, platforming different between traditional and indie publishing. So there's sort of that distinction between nonfiction and fiction, where nonfiction, yes, building things like doing a blog and becoming an influencer or authority in the topic that you are wanting to write about before you write that book can be incredibly valuable. As you said, not as important when you're talking about a fiction novelist who's going to be writing a romance or fantasy or sci-fi series along those lines, because what the audience is looking for is that story. And so until you have that set of stories, building a platform is not going to be incredibly valuable when those readers don't have anywhere to go from there for you.
Right, exactly.
When you talk about building a platform and you're talking about having a newsletter, having an author website, a lot of the talk gets into branding as well. How should authors think about branding, especially when it comes to authenticity? Because that's what I think is probably one of the most important parts, is being authentic as well. But that's also sort of a term which is, like you were talking about earlier, a little bit amorphous and hard to say exactly what that means. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on building a brand and being authentic, and how can authors accomplish those things?
So I'll tackle them separately, since I
Yeah.
don't necessarily think that this is going to be strange for me to say. I don't think you personally need to be authentic to build a strong brand. I'm thinking there's so many people with pen names. And so there's going to be a disconnect.
Right.
So with branding, I really see it as people understand what they're going to get from you. You're creating an expectation in people for what they're going to get. So I hope, with my brand, that when people come to me for information, or if they've learned about what I do in the industry, they're expecting um, no BS, practical information, cut to the chase, um, honestly delivered, accurately reported. That's what I'm going after. It's not very, it's more tough love. It's not very, I'm not going to say other people are sentimental or like, or let's say cheerleading. I'm not much of a cheerleader. Like, I'm going to support you however I can with market information. I'm not going to tell you it's easy, but I'm going to tell you what's required if you're up for the challenge. Um, so that's my brand: education and reporting on the nuts and bolts of the business. If I say Stephen King, to use a fiction example, most people, when I say, what's the first word that pops into your head, what's it going to be? Horror. And so you find that with authors who have reached a certain level of success, and even those who haven't, frankly, some of them have been very strategic in aligning themselves with, this is what you're going to expect from me. Now, I know some writers are going to react to that with, I don't want to be pigeonholed. I want to write lots of different things. And I don't think branding prevents that. I do think, regardless of what you want to write and publish, there is some sort of common thread that runs through it all. If someone meets you, for example, today, and then meets you 5 years from now and 10 years from now, are they going to see a common thread in your personality? Like, I do believe we each have an essence that is expressed in how we move throughout the world, how we behave. Go to any high school reunion and you're going to encounter what I am talking about. I was just at my 30th high school reunion. So you see that essence in people. Even now, if you haven't seen them in 30 years, you're like, I know you. I remember that about
Right.
you. That's part of what the branding is. And I think it's more the business perspective on how do you express that in a way that people grasp and understand. Now, there are a lot of touch points here, and this is where we can get really granular about it. Like book covers, for example. You want that cover is an expression of the brand, not just for the book, but for you, or maybe for the series and for you. And you want to make sure that it reflects what people have come to expect from what you deliver, the entertainment or the story, the experience. Your website, your newsletter, your business cards, the conferences you show up at, the organizations you partner with, all of these reflect on who you are and what you stand for. So the question to ask yourself with branding is, what do you want to be known for? And again, some people waffle and they say, well, I want to write this and I want to write that, and I'm hoping to do some poetry. And it's like, okay, what do you want to be in the first line of your obituary? Like, if I want to get just really direct with, what do you want to be remembered for after you are dead? I think that can bring some clarity to what is really just you having a little bit of fun on the side and what you deeply want to be remembered for after you're gone. So I don't mean to get too morbid. It is Halloween week, though, but I think the obituary exercise can be very useful for that. Now, the authenticity piece, when I think about authenticity, I'm really thinking about, are people putting on like the smarmy marketer hat, or do they feel like they have to switch voices or switch how they behave in the world in order to talk about their books or to market and promote? Are they acting one way in private and then doing something different in public? And I think often when there's a misalignment, it can come off as inauthentic. Um, but I mean, this is going to differ so much from person to person. And I think it's mainly, you have to find your comfort level. If people feel like you aren't comfortable with what you're doing online, I think they can perhaps perceive that you're inauthentic. I wonder what I'm sure there's a reason you're asking about the authenticity piece. So I'm curious what you're seeing.
I just think that something that you do really well with your newsletters, the hot sheet for, people who aren't subscribers, you always put like a story usually up front at the beginning of your newsletters. Like you went to a library or a bookstore
All
in
right.
Portugal, wasn't it?
Yes.
Um, and you were kind of like, well, I mean, it was a cool bookstore, but it's a very cool building, but maybe not like the best thing to be a bookstore where you're like paying to be admitted and then like people are
Right.
not really there for the books. It, you have these little vignettes in your
Yeah.
newsletters usually, which are like a story from your personal life. And that makes me, the reader, feel like I know you, like even though we don't have
Yeah.
a personal relationship. And I just feel like that brings a level of like authenticity
Yeah.
to who you are, and how you represent yourself, even just with those little bits from your life.
Yeah.
Because I just think it's very important, especially when we're talking about like building a brand and all that stuff. If it feels a little bit too much, there are a lot of companies in the publishing industry which generally, when you start a company in the publishing industry, you start off in a hole, right?
Yeah.
Like you have a negative reputation for trying to build something for authors, right? Like,
Yes. It's true.
because there have been so many scammers in the publishing
Yeah.
industry that like basically the assumption is when you're starting out, like you are a scammer, right?
Yeah.
So so for me, when I was building Story Origin, it was free for 3 years. And I would send out newsletters every single week with like, here are updates I'm making. Here's like a little vignette from my life, building trust between me and my own audience because uh, they know who I am personally, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think that that is especially important for authors as well when they're thinking about branding as well, especially as you were saying, sometimes authors like have pen names. And so like authenticity can be this sort of tricky question when you are writing under a different pen name than your own actual name.
Right.
And so it's a tricky thing to navigate. But I also feel like you can still share like little vignettes from your life, even if you are writing under a pen name and all that stuff. So
Yeah.
maybe you have some thoughts there as well.
I have thoughts about what I notice about changes over like the 20 years that I've been 25 years I've been working in this industry. I think there's something about, in particular, social media and how we interact online that has given us a window into people's lives that we didn't necessarily have before. And it's, and there are people who've commented on this phenomenon. We get to see very personally what people's lives are like. Now, I'm not saying that some of this is very deliberately crafted for your consumption. I can't deny that. But there's the sense that we're going to get something more behind the scenes, a little more personal, when we engage with people in social media environments. And some of you may have read about this phenomenon called the parasocial relationship, where someone, it could be a celebrity, but it doesn't have to be. Someone has a large following, and people feel like they really are friends with this person, or they have a meaningful relationship because they have been making disclosures of a personal nature. Um, Now, parasocial relationships can be complicated for the person, like the author, who's navigating those, because then people feel like they can be disappointed in you. They can like, there can be negative ramifications there. So it can be both a blessing and a curse. And I think this is also what creates anxiety in some authors about being active on social media or having a brand or being authentic. You're waiting for the curse aspect of that to come back at you. And as someone who's been engaging online now for quite some time, I've been burned myself, but much less, I think, than the average author. I put myself in with the authors because I'm writing and producing all sorts of work. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I don't want to go into them at the moment, but we can explore it if people are interested. But I think if you do go in with that authenticity, and if you do find that alignment, um, I think that helps. And I think it's also important to create the boundaries that preserve your mental health. And you decide, I'm talking about these two, three, or four things on social media, but these other things, and for many people that could be family, children, these things are kind of off limits, and I'm not going to be talking about those issues.
I think it makes sense to transition a little bit more towards some concrete advice here, especially because we're talking about having relationships with people. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to build a newsletter. I feel like it is better than social media, personally, uh, because you actually can have a little bit more of a real relationship with individuals via email than you can on social media, where feels a little bit more detached, like you are on a stage and people are just there watching you rather than having a conversation with you.
Mhm.
That's my own, of course, personal opinion. But let's just start with newsletters. When should an author start one?
I mean, I don't think it's ever too early to start, frankly, because if you've never sent one, I think it takes a little bit of time to get comfortable with the medium and to kind of get over some of the initial hurdles of what do I say? This feels awkward. And, to have some practice, essentially practice newsletters for family, friends, and others who are in your more immediate circle who are going to be your first subscribers. Um, I just put a link into the chat because I think it's really important at this point to distinguish between newsletters and Substack, which I think often have different purposes. Substack has really confused the issue of newsletter sending. And if you start talking about newsletters, someone's going to ask about Substack anyway. So I think it's important to kind of get this out of the way. The value of an email newsletter has always been there in my mind, very consistent, very powerful, going back to the early 2000s. I think it's just that only today or within the last 5 years have people finally understood that email is not dead. Email is a very powerful marketing tool, and email outlasts social media and you get a better return on your time from email than you do on social media, in my experience. Probably
I
yours
absolutely
too.
agree. I absolutely agree.
So I just want to be clear, email newsletters are not equivalent to Substack. So I advocate for the free email newsletter for every author as something fundamental to your platform and something that preserves your platform strength even as the outside world of social media and whatever else changes frequently and all the time. The people who subscribe to your email newsletter, I'm going to assume, are there willingly. They actually asked to sign up. You didn't put them there against their will, and they are your most loyal, engaged folks. So we're going to work with that assumption. I know there are a lot of people out there who practice bad email hygiene, do things to get people on their list that result in high unsubscribes, people maybe even spamming. I'm not talking about those people. And I'm sorry if you've encountered them because they're giving email a bad reputation. Substack is, I see it as social media newsletters, which, it started off as a tool for people who wanted to charge for their newsletter, which is an entirely different thing than having a free email newsletter for your readers. Totally different. Not saying it's bad, but I think it has really muddied the waters as to where the real power of email is. If you want to run a subscription business and try to get people to pay for your email, more power to you. It is one of the most difficult things on the planet to accomplish. And I say this with 10 years of experience running a paid newsletter. um, Now, I think you mentioned when should people start it? What is it? I don't think it's ever too early to start because I think ultimately, if you're an author trying to put out work that is being purchased by readers, you're going to have a newsletter that reaches them. Then you get into questions of frequency and what do you put in it. Frequency, I think once a month is kind of, I think, the minimum viable frequency, because then the list names can decay, meaning that the names go bad or people forget who you are, or so try to do it monthly. And it doesn't as far as what goes in it, I think people probably put too much burden on themselves to make it this long, meaningful, substantive tome that allows them to say, I deserve to press send. It does not have to be this big elaborate thing. Now, I'm not saying you should treat it um, like, I don't know, so casually that you'll just send it at any time, any place with just a few sentences. But it's okay to treat it as a newsletter in the very, like, going back to the true origin of that, a little bit of news that covers what's happened over the last month. You know, highlights of what you've been talking about on social media, if you use social media, highlights of what you've written or published lately, events, um, reviews. Doesn't really matter. I think it's just as long as it has a spirit. I think I like having a spirit of play in the newsletter. I don't want to, you want people to feel delighted when they receive it. Um, you want something of your personality, that authentic piece you said, you want that to come out. But you also want to have some nuts and bolts in there that are just for the people who want to keep up with what you're doing. Now, some people do get much more elaborate with this. There's more of what I would call like a content strategy associated with the newsletter, where they're running interviews or they're curating media of some kind. And it might take a lot more time to put together. Like my free newsletter uh, would fit that description. It's a little bit more involved, but I also enjoy doing it. So if you currently really abhor the newsletter format, as I'm telling you how important it is, I would ask, well, what would make it more enjoyable for you? Maybe you have been approaching it from the wrong direction. It's like the newsletter of me. And don't we all like to talk about ourselves to some extent? What is it that people need to know that happened in the last month, and what would delight you to have a record of that, 5 or 10 years from now, if you looked back on it, you would say, oh yeah, I remember that happening, or that was a really interesting time, or I'm really glad I preserved that so I could remember.
I think a couple of things that you mentioned in there are really important. So send at least once a month. If you're sending less than that, you're going to have generally like higher unsubscribe rates. People might
Yeah,
forget why they joined your mailing list in the
yeah,
first place. If you only send, if you wait a year between sending newsletters, you're like, who are you? Why am I on this mailing list? Like, did you put me on this like as a spam? So you also might get hit with like higher complaint rates where people are marking your email as spam if they haven't heard from you in a while. And especially I don't know how everyone else's email velocity is, but I feel like many people get many emails per day. And
yes,
so if you're only getting an email once every 3 months, it's just like that was a lifetime ago. I got an
yeah,
email from someone, they were following up on something, and I was like, "Oh, when did they send that last email?" It felt like, like a month and a half ago. And I look back and it was 2 weeks ago, right?
yeah,
And it's just because the velocity of emails is so high that feels
yeah,
like the time between them can be really large. And so I commonly hear from authors saying they don't want to bother people, right?
right, yes,
They don't want
yes,
to feel like spam in someone's mailbox. Uh, but at the same time, the very act of not sending emails is actually what will end up getting you marked as spam.
yes, yes. I hear that line all the time. I don't want to bother people. And I think part of it is born of the fact that a lot of people send bad emails, and you yourself feel bothered by
Right.
some of the emails you receive. But don't take that as an indicator that yours is going to have the same effect if you are following best practices, if you're trying to delight people, if you have gathered people onto your list in good ways, meaning people understand what you're going to send, they've willingly asked to receive it. All of the good hygiene things that we ask when you send email newsletters. And you're not bothering people if they ask to receive it, and you're providing some sort of a service in the sense of, I am helping you stay up to date with something you're interested in.
So there are two parts. One is have that newsletter, do that piece where you're sharing little bits about your life and what you're doing. Everyone's always got something that they can talk about that they did in the past week, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's as simple as I took my dog for a walk in the park. It was lovely. Here's a picture of my dog. I will sometimes in my newsletters share like pictures of, we went to the pumpkin patch the other day to buy pumpkins for Halloween, right? Like stuff like that. Um, and then the other part of your newsletter is you said is the nuts and bolts. I usually break this down into building rapport and providing value. That's how I generally think of those two parts, or those are the names that I give to those two pieces, is building rapport and providing value. So that building rapport piece can just be those little stories from your life. Everyone's always got something to share. But how do authors provide value on a monthly basis when they might only be releasing or publishing something once every, 6 months or 12 months or every 2 years? What provides that reader with the value to continue opening and clicking on your emails? Because I can send out every week pictures of my dog, right? But ultimately, if I send out pictures of my dog every single week, people are going to unsubscribe because they're like, "What?" I mean, Evan, yes, your dog is very cute, but I am not here for that. So what is, yeah, how can authors provide value to their subscribers?
I don't know, Evan. I mean, people love pet photos. I would not underestimate the power of a pet photo sent every week, especially if there's a shtick involved. Like, what can my dog balance on his head this week?
Oh, there we go.
Um, so, like, again, I think it's this element of delight that that people are going to find something fun or something they can share, or it lighten. I mean, I'm thinking right now in particular, I'm thinking of things that lighten the mood. So if this newsletter is going to help do that with a dog photo, I am going to take a look. Um, but the value piece, I think it varies so much from author to author. I think one of the things I often point people toward is the media consumption list. And that's just shorthand for what have you consumed in the last week or month that kind of aligns with your category or genre that you think is also going to interest your readers. So, if you write in a particular genre, I'm willing to bet you're engaged with other authors in that genre. You're reading books, listening to podcasts, whatever it is that you do to stay current in your genre. And then you share bits of that. People love discovering new authors, new podcasts, new audiobooks, new whatever it is. And so you can mention those things. And it's also an act of literary citizenship because now you're helping someone else, find their readership, and they're likely to repay the favor in the future. So that's something to consider, the media consumption. Obviously, you can, I don't advocate like being e-commerce focused in your general author newsletter, but if you have specials or deals or limited time discounts or freebies or things that happen, make sure your newsletter readers know about them. And it may be something too that you're not going to have every issue, but when you do have them, you have to make them obvious to people, especially if they're scrolling through quickly. I find that people are oddly reticent to mention their books in their own author newsletter because they think it'll come off too much as a hard sell. But one of the reasons people are on that list is to learn about special opportunities that they might otherwise miss because they're not following your every move on social media or following your Amazon page to see when the book got marked down. So let them know about those things. I mean, you probably have many more ideas about providing value, but again, it's so based on the readership and what they appreciate.
I think you hit the most important thing that I personally see is that, like, media consumption list. I look at it like this. Readers are usually looking for their next book to read, right? Or their next movie to watch, right? And if you can provide them with an ideas for what the next thing that they might want to read or watch can be, that is providing them value. Because a reader can read many more books per year than you can ever write.
Right.
And so they might be subscribed to you as an author to hear about your new releases. And so doing things like talking about when you have a new release or when you're running a discount on your series or something of that sort is definitely also providing value to your readers. And that is separate and apart from that sort of that building rapport piece.
I wanted to add one more thing that I
Yeah.
forgot to mention, which is behind the scenes information. Now, this will vary again for every author, but I'm primarily a nonfiction reader, and some of my favorite newsletters are from people who place articles, essays, reported pieces where they share what went into the making of that piece. It's just I mean, I'm someone who writes similar material. I report on pieces. I just love hearing how like some of the difficult times people had in just getting something out, or the reporting that they had to do, or the stuff that didn't make it into the piece, and then they put that into the newsletter. So depending on how you write your fiction, you might not have too many outtakes or behind the scenes, but don't discount the power of giving people that inside look at how the sausage gets made.
Absolutely. I would say that is another piece that readers, especially, I think, put authors on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is something that when you are an author or when you're a guy sitting in your house writing software, right? Like you don't feel like you're on a pedestal. You just feel the constant grind of like meeting deadlines and trying to hit your word count goals and all of that stuff. And it doesn't feel like you're a celebrity. But to a reader, even if even if you are not like the biggest name in the world, but this reader really loves your book, you are kind of a celebrity to them. And so they want to hear more about like, oh, like what gave you the idea for how this character did this or whatever this interaction was. People love that stuff, and that is one of those things that you're not going to put into the back of your book, right? Like, here's all
Right.
my thought process or whatever. But you can kind of think about it like the director's commentary. Like you might go and you might buy the DVD just to get the director's commentary to hear like what their thoughts were if that's a director that you love. And so you as the author can kind of put yourself into that same position. So yeah,
Exactly.
I love that idea as well. Another good idea there is when you're talking about providing them recommendations and things that they might be interested in can provide value to those readers as well. I would say that you don't necessarily have to restrain yourself to things that you've read. It might just be other books that you've seen in your
Mhm.
genre that look interesting to you.
Yeah.
But everyone's got a busy schedule. You can't necessarily be reading a book a month if you also have a full-time job and you're writing in your spare time, and then you're trying to read a bunch of
Mhm.
books to see what you might recommend in your newsletter. So I kind of tell authors to think about this section also as just other things that readers might like. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, I vouch for everything on this list, because even if you have read it all, that doesn't mean that everyone else is going to have the exact same taste as you.
Right.
Um, I might
Yeah.
love a movie and you might not, and so I might highly recommend it, but that's still not might be your cup of tea.
I was going to mention in my free newsletter, I have a feature for readers to contribute their suggestions. And if you have a big enough list, that can also be very interesting for people to see what other readers of the newsletter recommend. But you need a kind of a critical mass in order for that to work out. You need enough people who are willing to respond.
We've got a mailing list, right? We've signed up to an email service provider like MailChimp or MailerLite or ActiveCampaign or ConvertKit or something along those lines. You can design and you can send a newsletter. We know what makes a good newsletter, but what is actually going to entice people to sign up to our newsletter? Like, why would a reader willingly submit their email address to us?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So I think so much here relies on you being very thoughtful with the sign up form or the call to action. So there are many different places someone might encounter this. It could be on your website, it could be in the back of your book, it could be on social media, it might be in an event, it could be on your business card, it could be in an email signature, so many different places. Wherever people encounter it, though, you need to give them a really particular reason for signing up that isn't going to be like everyone else's reason. In other words, if you say sign up for my newsletter, no one is probably going to do it because no one signs up for newsletters. They sign up for something particular from you who they enjoy and they don't want to miss out on whatever it is that you're sending. So, for me, I tell people, well, if you subscribe to my free newsletter, you're going to get information on digital tools and resources for creative people to make your life more joyful. So it's a more lighthearted, um, look at some of the tools that I encounter and use that I think you might want to check out. And then, there's other stuff in there too from my readers, and there's a little story you mentioned, and so on. Um, so one way to know if you're getting it right is to think, is there someone else who could lift this language or any of the imagery that's surrounding it? Can anyone else take that and use it and essentially keep the same promise? The answer should be no. It should be very unique to you and what you're attempting to do. Obviously, this, if you're just really new and starting your email newsletter, like if you're kind of in the more practice mode I suggested before with just family and friends, you might not yet know what that sign up language should be. And it's okay, you might be in the period of figuring it out. But once, things are really underway, I would get more disciplined in what it is, like the value that you're offering, or what it is that people are uniquely going to get from this newsletter that you're sending out. Now, there are some people, like if someone is a fan of your work, frankly, I don't know that it matters much what you tell them, because they just want everything that you do. And so once you reach that point, a lot of the pressure is off. Okay. That's the good news. But until you reach you start reaching that base of loyal fans, you do need to be very specific with why people should sign up, and that indicating it's not just this other useless thing that lands in your inbox. Um, at the end of it, I don't necessarily promote this as a feature of my newsletter because it's more fun for me than anything. But if I were doing a reading or doing some sort of event with that focuses on my book, and I really wanted people to sign up for my free newsletter, I might say, make sure you sign up for my newsletter tonight, because the next issue in a couple days is going to feature my absolute top-notch favorite chocolate chip cookie recipe that you must prepare. Hopefully that would actually tie into whatever I was discussing, but like, give people that motivation. I don't want to miss that thing that's coming.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And you as well will also sometimes give people like resources if they sign up to your newsletter, right?
Yes, so the ethical bribe. So the or some people say it's a lead magnet or some sort of freebie. Um, it's I think this is really tough to gauge. Like, what should you offer people in exchange? And you also have to be mindful that some people will sign up just for the freebie, and then unsubscribe, or they become dormant, or they weren't really interested in you. They were just interested in this free thing. So be aware. You want the free thing to match, hopefully, the reason people are going to want to be on your newsletter in the first place, and it's not totally divorced. I don't think offering the first chapter of your novel is particularly compelling because people can get that off Amazon. Um, but if it's an outtake, like a little novella that's based on your series that's not otherwise available, that actually makes a lot of sense to me as a freebie. So you need to make sure that what you're offering is really a compelling offer. I see a lot of weak offers out there.
Yeah, what are some of the other ideas that a author might use for that like freebie or lead magnet or reader magnet or cookie or whatever
Right.
whatever you might want to. There's so many different terms that people use.
Yeah.
You mentioned like a using a side story or something of the
Mm-hmm.
sort. Do you have any other suggestions, or like what might work better than just like a sample, like better than like just the first chapter of your published book?
Anything that would give people more of the world you've created, more of the characters you've created that wouldn't otherwise be available. So it could be in the form of short stories, novellas, outtakes, spin-offs. And maybe this is a freebie that you ultimately are going to use in some future work. That's fine. You do need to change these freebies up from time to time. You can't keep using the same one forever and ever. So you can have that freebie do double duty for you, but usually for fiction writers, it's going to be something related to the stories or the worlds that you're creating. There may be some other things that you could get really creative and say, oh, here's like if you're writing a cozy mystery with a chef as the protagonist, going back to the recipe idea, maybe you're giving people a set of recipes or wine pairings. I don't know, but again, you have to be careful. If some people just want recipes and they don't care about your novels, that's not good.
Right.
For nonfiction writers, I mean, I think it's so much easier if you're writing prescriptive things that teach people how to do things. I mean, it's really sky's the limit. I don't think nonfiction authors really actually need a lot of guidance on what to do because you've probably written so much material that can be repackaged or reassembled in a way that's kind of a compelling freebie.
Right, like if you're a weight loss author or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, it might be like, here's a meal prep, weekly,
Right.
meal prep guide, or like here's a workout regimen.
Yep.
So it's sort of
Yep.
things like, worksheets, or
Mm-hmm.
guides, or uh some sort of, maybe even like a companion to your book,
Yes.
that it's like,
Sure.
read the book, and at the same time you do these things, and this will also help guide you along,
Yep.
making what the advice in the nonfiction book actionable.
Mm-hmm.
um and then I loved the things that you said for fiction authors as well. Those would be things like side stories, or an anthology of short stories you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned. One other idea is like doing a prequel is a good
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
good idea for a lot of authors, because prequels also don't necessarily require that the person have read the first book in your series, and come in with that background knowledge the same way like a side story might, or an outtake might. And so doing something like a prequel could be good. The one thing that you mentioned though that's really important is like, make sure whatever you're using as your reader magnet ties in with what what that series is. So like,
Yeah.
recipes, if you have like a sort of a murder mystery, and like cozy murder mystery, and like, it's like about a bakery or something like that. I've seen some authors make mistakes here where the target audience for the reader magnet is very different from the
Yes.
target audience of the series. So for example, like, I've seen authors that write um you know uh cozy romance novels will sometimes do like a steamy prequel, and then people that like pick up that prequel then buy into the series, and they're like, what is this? Nothing is happening. Where's the steam?
Right. Right.
And so yeah, even if it's sort of similar in that, like, yes, I'm giving a reader a story, like, you also have to still make sure the genres are aligned too there.
Yes. Yes.
We've got a reason that someone signs up to our mailing list, right? We've got our email service provider. When someone signs up to our email list, like, now what? Like, now they're on our now they're on our
Yeah.
email list. Like, what should we do? We should probably send them an email and be like, "Hey, thanks for joining," right? Like, at a minimum.
So there are two paths to take here. That the light and easy path is to have a single thank you, welcome to the list message that's essentially automated, but you do generally need to update it over time. And it can do things like offer people, it can offer an FAQ, or it can introduce people to what you write or to your books. Especially, it's going to depend on how you're building the list, how what you exactly want to put in that welcome message. Like, how are they finding you? Are they going to already be familiar with this or not? So keep in mind the context, but you but it's a great opportunity to show people, hey, you're getting this from a human being, and to be more personal. I saw one author who actually put a picture of their pet rabbit at the top of the confirmation email, just as a way of just saying, "Hey, I'm human." Here, pet photos always win
Right, yeah,
again.
building rapport, exactly.
Exactly. Now that's the light, easy way. And if your list is pretty small, and if you've only got one book, you might not need anything more than that. There are also sequences that you can run, and for authors that have lots of different books, or they write different types of series, or they're really well established, then you might have like a series of 2, 3, or 4 messages that step people through various facets of your work or explain different aspects. I think it tends to be more popular in my experience with nonfiction authors who are kind of getting you up to speed on certain aspects of whatever it is you want to learn about. um, Especially if they're hoping, I see this a lot with nonfiction authors who want you to like subscribe to something on a monthly basis. That could be a paid newsletter, it could be a course, it could be something else. And so they're giving you this very long, maybe 5 to 10 email sequence that helps educate you and also primes you to make a purchase at the very end. That's getting into very advanced territory. I don't think applies that much to fiction writers unless you're a really hard-nosed marketer, but some nonfiction authors might find those sorts of series very useful. For my paid newsletter, because there is a free trial associated with it, 30 days, I do a 3 message sequence that introduces people to the content. I highlight the most important things that they probably should have read from the newsletter prior to them subscribing. And it's categorized. So, like, there's an intro email about AI, which people have a lot of questions on. There's an intro email on what are book sales like and what are the trends like at this moment. And I link to things I've recently published so that people, even though the newsletter only comes out, they're only going to get like 2 issues before the trial ends. They're going to get so much more from that sequence. And by the end, they're going to understand whether or not they really want to pay money to subscribe. So, depending on what you do at the end of that sequence, if there's a specific action you want people to take, you need to think about how you're building to yes at the end of it.
Yeah, I think something that would be incredibly valuable there for at least for fiction authors, and I imagine nonfiction authors, would be a call to action at the end of your welcome sequence to get them, if you have a review team, that you give early manuscripts to 6 to 8 weeks ahead of publication date,
Yeah.
and they can read that free copy. And then when you publish it on day one, you've got people there that are ready to go and post a review of that book. That's generally what I've seen a lot of authors do with the end of their welcome sequences, is join my review team. But it could also be like a join my street team, where people just publish when I have new releases. They might post about it on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, and just help act as a cheerleader for me.
Yeah.
And so, whatever you can do in your welcome sequence to, like you said, getting people to a yes to that call to action is incredibly valuable. So that's stuff like building rapport with them, telling them a little bit about yourself, and why they should get started reading your books as well. Which I think applies even if you're a fiction author as well. Like we were talking about nonfiction authors, but also many fiction readers have a to be read list that is like
Yeah.
200 books long.
Yes.
And so even if they got your free thing and they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, I picked up your like prequel or whatever, and they have it downloaded to their Kindle or wherever else, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to read it.
Right.
And so yeah, doing whatever you can to get that book to the top of their to be read pile can still be super valuable too. For building websites, do you recommend authors go with like a professional website designer or DIY it?
It really depends on your skills and patience level, time available, how quickly you need something up and running that looks great, that has to accomplish a particular goal. Um, I do think it's within the skill set of most authors to build their own website depending on the platform they choose to build it. So, for example, Squarespace, I think, is pretty user friendly. It's going to cost you some money every month, but you can get something pretty nice looking out of that without a lot of time invested. My tool of choice is WordPress. I find that for some folks, it's too big of a learning curve and they end up with kind of poor looking results and they might have to hire a firm to get the ball rolling. It's totally fine. I do like WordPress more than other tools because it's open source. I think it's built to last. And I like websites that are built to last over decades because that's how long your career will be, I hope. And I've been using WordPress since 2005. So I'm definitely invested at this point in that system. But there are other like very lightweight tools. I know Story Origin has a lightweight tool. They can get a site up and running very quickly. Authors Guild has their own tools that they offer to members. Hell, you can even get away with a link tree. Not that I recommend it, but I've seen authors do it. And or Substacks. I don't like that, but again, I've seen authors do it. So it just depends on your needs at any particular moment in time. And some of these really lightweight options, um, I just saw the Story Origin platform. I'm guessing it's like this, similar to like Linktree and Substack. It constrains your choices, which is often a good thing because if you have too many choices, you're more likely to end up with a really poor looking website that doesn't accomplish what you want.
Yeah. Story Origin has a website builder, and it's, designed to take 30 seconds to build your website,
Yeah.
because I do find authors, when they are sort of given a platform like WordPress, where you can customize literally any and everything. You end up spending a ton of time fiddling with like, okay, should I change the spacing between
Yep.
like these two things? How should I lay this out? And it can get super in the weeds. But one thing that you mentioned that's important there is like it depends on what your needs are as an author. What would you say are like the crucial elements for an author website where an author might be like, oh, yeah, I can solve this with like a page that just has some links to my social media? Or do I need something more than that?
I'm going to assume you have books out or something that you want people to buy or read. So your website first needs a front door, it needs the homepage. That kind of introduces people to you, establishes expectations, expresses your brand. Usually, you do that through the book covers. I think some authors make the mistake of overcomplicating the homepage with a lot of imagery or really bold colors. And without a professional's help, you can get into trouble really quickly with that, with just something that doesn't look good, or is hard to read, or doesn't prioritize what people need to see, which is your book covers. Please use your book covers. Um, this is a big mistake I often see. I hope people gather, not putting the book covers front and center. So there's your homepage, and then you want a dedicated page for each book. So even if you have 100 books, dedicated page for each book, that's going to have your like a summary, the cover, links to the retailers in various formats, the key ones for your book. You need a decent about page that talks about like has your professional bio, has more detail for your fans if you want to go into more personal detail, and a contact page that people can contact you through media, reviewers, others who might want to offer you an opportunity of some kind, speaking or teaching. Make it easy for them to reach out, have a contact page. And then there are other things you can have on that website. Obviously, you'll see people with media kits or speaking and appearances or blogs, etc. But I think what I've just mentioned, those are by far that to me the must-haves: the homepage, the books, about, contact, and putting that together. It's not rocket science. I think the hardest part is often just gathering up all of those retailer links, getting all the buttons in place, and making sure that it looks okay.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll mention there, especially with retailer links, so like Story Origin has a universal book link feature, but you can find this in other places as well, is you'll also want to make sure that if, for example, Amazon is not just Amazon.com, it's also Amazon.co.uk and Amazon.com.au and Amazon.ca. And so they have all of these different storefronts for a bunch of different countries. And
Yeah.
so having those links to those other Amazon storefronts where you're selling your book can be quite valuable as well, because readers from other countries might make up 10 to 15% of your audience. At least that's sort of the percentage that I've heard when I've talked to authors about, what do their sales look like internationally. For those authors who are writing in English, a lot of times they're making, 10 to 15% of their sales outside of the US. And so if you send someone to Amazon.com, that creates a frustration for that reader if they're in the UK and they need the Amazon.co.uk link. Using a service to create a universal book link that will localize that Amazon store link to that reader's country can be quite valuable. Or even just listing them out. If you don't want to use another service, just list out, here's the Amazon.com link and here's the Amazon.co.uk link. And you don't have to do this for every country that Amazon has a storefront in, but probably want to hit up like at least Amazon for US, the UK, Australia, South Africa, the major English speaking languages where they're probably going to be reading your books as well. Jane, I know we're a little bit past the hour here, so I just want to say thank you again so much for coming out and chatting with us. Before you go, though, I'm sure there are many people who have many more questions that we did
Yeah.
not address today. Where can people follow you and learn more from you?
The best place to go is my website, which is at janefriedman.com. I'm putting that into the chat, and that goes to all my newsletters. You'll find the free and the paid newsletters, my books, my classes, and other ways to keep up with me, like through social media.
If they have any questions for me, you can reach out to me at Evan at storyoriginApp.com. And I just want to say thanks again, Jane, and we'll see you all in the next one.